Well, welcome everyone to this first We Are Company webinar. Thanks for joining us. We've had nearly 100 people register for this webinar, so I expect other people will join us in, but it's time to make a start. I'm joined today, my name's Simon Barrington, I'm one of the founders of We Are Company. I'm joined today by my two co-founders in We Are Company, Matthew Frost. Matthew, why don't you say hi?
Hi everybody, great to have you on this webinar.
And also Andrew Williams.
Hi all.
We are recording this session today, that's will be available afterwards for people, colleagues maybe who weren't able to attend. We have got you all on mute. Our questioning session will be on the chat. So Matthew Frost will be handling the question and answer session at the end. And we'd love you, just as we go through this, to chat with us on the chat, ask away questions, but also make observations as well to everybody, and we'd love you to participate in that way. This is one of 6 webinars, and they're going to take place every Thursday at 3 o'clock between now and the 7th of May. And we're going to be looking at all different elements of relationships. So how can we thrive in a time of social distancing, which we're going to be joined by our colleagues from the Relationships Foundation, Dr. Rob Lowe and his colleagues next week. And then how can I thrive as an individual? How can we thrive in our relationships with another? How can we thrive in our use of technology as well? So we hope you won't only join us for today, but you'll join us in those future sessions as well. I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, and Andrew's going to speak for about 20 minutes in the first session. Then we'll do a quick poll with you, and then Andrew will come back and look at his second 2 sections, and then we'll have a question and answer. So Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Hello, everyone. As you know, I'm Andrew Williams. So let's cut straight to the chase and what we're going to try and get out of this session. And there's 3 core areas we're going to discuss. One is to understand and consider the importance of relationships. We are of the view that sometimes they can be neglected, but we need to establish the criteria by why they are important. Then we'll have a section which looks at what we are hearing from people like yourselves, and also what society is learning. So some of the anecdotes and stories that we are hearing on how people are seeing the current COVID-19 crisis and what that means and how that resonates. And finally, we're going to have a little think through the short and long-term implications of this and what it could mean to business. So that 3rd section will be also signposting future webinars. So we're quite excited by that. Just to get our vocabulary right at the start, because on this we have a number of people from both not-for-profit and for-profit organizations. So just to understand how we think about a common word we use, the word company. In 500 AD, the original Latin was companio, which was those you break bread with, and then later on the French extended that definition somewhat. But we would be of the view that a company serves a very clear set, or should serve a very clear set of purposes, which is significantly larger than perhaps a more traditional definition of Western, which often goes to the financial part. So it's important to think we see company as highly relational, as well as the other key metrics. To get on that journey on exploring company and its purpose, we've been working with the Relationship Foundation over the last couple of years, an institution which we've found exciting and stimulating to work with, who've got 25 plus years thought leadership and practical application, especially in cross sectors, but also in places like schools. How did that relationship is a good way of how we've actually evolved and developed. I use the phrase there, deliberate serendipity, which is slightly incorrect, but the point would be, I got to know Simon Barrington because we went to Mozambique with the television crew together as part of his Samaritan's Purse role. My sister was on the advisory board with Rob Lowe, who's the chief exec and chairman of Relationship Foundation. So I got to know Rob. Simon, at the same time, was in the same peer group as Matthew. And Matthew, coincidentally or parallel processing, knew the Relationship Foundation well. And ultimately, we all sat down in Natural Kitchen about 2 years ago, explored what we were thinking and thought, let's explore this properly together and see if we can start to think about how we can reshape companies and think of them more relationally. And what I'll just show now is a video which gives a bit of context for what's happening and what people are thinking about.
The virus crisis is changing life as we know it dramatically tonight.
I can't wait for a year's time when all of this is a distant memory. And there is a corona baby boom because all the lovers were loving. And there is a rise in small businesses because all the entrepreneurs had a moment of stillness and creativity. And all the children remember nothing but a time when all the mums and dads were at home drawing and playing ball games, and we remember it as the time we all got to stop and be present. We will remember the time our health was our first priority and people learned new ways to use fresh produce to feed their families. We remember the laughter and fun on TikTok, FaceTiming with our friends and family each day, date nights in the house, and home PE workouts with Joe Wicks. A time our real heroes in the NHS urged us to stay at home for the greater good, and our country showing their support by turning Wembley and the Angel of the North blue. And we were all forced to think outside the box and dream up new things and reinvent old ways, and for once, even amongst the chaos, there was community. There was a global rise in togetherness, and as the streets were quiet, our homes were bustling with love and laughter. That time is coming soon, just like any other crisis before it. This will all be a distant memory, a thing we soon listen to our children discuss in classrooms, a once was, that we share with our grandchildren. So to you, I know it's unsettling, but focus on the silver lining. We're all in this together, and there is so much beauty to see.
Okay, so that sets a bit of some of the thinking that's going on in quite a thought-provoking video. So what we're actually going to go through in our agenda is first an understanding of the centrality of relationships by looking at the thought leaders, the role of trust, and then what the Relationship Foundation have produced from that in terms of the proximity framework. Again, what we are hearing and learning, and then going into some practical examples and about what that means relationally, both here and now and reimagine in the future, or reimagine the future, as I've clearly typed there. So to put some context on it, this is a reasonably typical balanced scorecard, which I'm sure we've all seen before, looking at organization, processes, customer and finance, wrapped around a vision and strategy. And I think just to draw out of that is, those are the key metrics. So those are the things that we are looking at, but relationships aren't currently in those metrics. So if relationships are important, which we believe they are, then why not? Daniel Goleman looks at very much emotional intelligence, looking at, again, I won't give you a cerebral discourse on this, but the self-awareness in terms of what you understand about yourself, and that leading to what you understand on others in terms of empathy, etc. And then how you manage your emotions, both positively and negatively, to challenge yourself positively on negative emotions, but also to harness those positive emotions so you move to a place where you're really looking at first-class relationship management. Again, these examples I will largely quote, and if you want to read more on Goldman, please do. Lencioni is another thought leader in this area who talks about dysfunctions in the team. One of the things that I personally like about Lencioni is how he pulls out two things from my perspective. One is the foundational nature of trust. So without that foundational nature of trust, it's very hard to build team cohesion and high-performing teams. And he talks very eloquently about conflict. Conflict's a very difficult thing to deal with, and there can be considered a propensity across all businesses and companies to toe the party line or to avoid conflict, whereas really what Lencioni advocates is constructive use of conflict to enable mutual growing when you have a trusted environment. So that's what I see largely in Lencioni. And perhaps this is a good example at a more sort of straightforward level is the Gallup survey, the employee engagement. And there we have the 12 indicators that they measure through their questionnaire. And the statistics which are mentioned of 13% is that's what they believe through doing these surveys globally of employees being truly, truly engaged. So there's quite a gap between thoughts on engagement and where that actually is. And I believe those three things then are good examples of thinking which drives that relationships are absolutely critical and important moving forward. If we then move on from foundational in all those is the aspect of trust in those relationships and the building of trust. The trusted advisor looks at four core variables in there: the credibility, reliability, intimacy, and self-orientation, to define a level of trustworthiness. Obviously, this is largely done in the context of both consulting and management and service industries, and how you build accounts and the components of trusted sales. So it's worth reading up a little bit more on that. But it's very important to think of how I build that trust by looking at those four component parts. The credibility of what I'm saying, how reliable I am in that, a level of intimacy with people, which is, I would personally be of the view, is frequently neglected. An example being from my previous days, a sales director explaining how brilliant he was as a salesman. And I asked him how many children his key contact had, and they didn't know. So they might have been selling well, but were they building a trusted relationship? And were they actually driving towards the ultimate purpose of our organization, which I like to think was a lot more than just profit? And then in HBR, Harvard, helpfully, I think, defines three core aspects of developing trust: relationship, consistency, and knowledge and expertise. Knowledge expertise has went through a bad patch, could be argued, last year, but maybe with we start to see a rise in respect in experts moving forward. But what's interesting as well is in the what matters most for trust, relationships again came to the fore. So if we are trying to build trust, and if we are looking to build relationships and build them excellently for the purpose of our business and our stakeholders, then it's pretty critical we look at not just knowledge and consistency, but how we develop that relationship. Here's a Simon Sinek video which shows the correlation between performance and trust. Which is the more important? So if we are striving for high performance teams, what does that mean in terms of trust?
I've worked with the Navy SEALs, and I asked them, like, how do you pick like the guys that go on SEAL Team 6, right? Because they're the best, the best, the best, the best. And they drew a graph for me, and on one side they wrote the word performance, and on the other side they wrote the word trust. The way they define the terms is performance on the battlefield and performance off the battlefield. So this is your skills. This is, did you make your quarterly earnings, whatever, however you want to translate it, right? Performance, it's traditional. This is, how are you off the battlefield? What kind of person are you? The way they put it is, I may trust you with my life, but do I trust you with my money and my wife? This is what they told me. Nobody wants this person, the low performer of low trust, of course. Of course, everybody wants this person, the high performer of high trust, of course. What they learned is that this person, the high performer of low trust, is a toxic leader and a toxic team member. And they would rather have a medium performer of high trust, sometimes even a low performer of high trust, it's a relative scale, over this person. This is the highest performing organization on the planet, and this person is more important than this person. And the problem in business is we have lopsided metrics. We have 1,000,001 metrics to measure someone's performance and negligible to no metrics to measure someone's trustworthiness. And so what we end up doing is promoting or bonusing toxicity in our businesses, which is bad for the long game because it eventually destroys the whole organization. The irony is it's unbelievably easy to find these people. Go to any team and say, who's the asshole? And they'll... they will all point to the same person. Equally, if you go to any team and say, who do you trust more than anybody else? Who's always got your back? And when the chips are down, they will be there with you. They will also all point to the same person. It's the best gifted natural leader who's creating an environment for everybody else to succeed, and they may not be your most individual highest performer. But that person, you better keep them on your team.
So I think that's useful to give the correlation performance and trust. I'm using a slightly out there example here in Joe Wicks, who builds trust. So I'm sure those of you who hadn't heard of Joe Wicks a month ago probably have now. Joe Wicks, I think, is a great example of building trust online. And there's 4 things I observe him doing in building that trust online. So he started, for those of you who don't know, he's a personal trainer who's been in the media a lot and author of, I think, 15-minute lean or 15-minute workouts. And he started by setting these national 9 o'clock in the morning workouts, which have had over 1 million people attending. One of the things that I think he's done well in his communication is the personal and generous nature of that. So in setting that up, his statement came out earlier this week, which is something along the lines of, while I am the nation's personal trainer, all the money that goes from his advertising through this will go straight to charities in the NHS, which if you compare that with some of the challenges Mike Ashley faced on some of their decision making on Sports Direct, gives you a feeling for the strength of that future brand. He's consistent. He talks about fitness as an enabler. So he doesn't talk about fitness as in, I'm all going to give you all big biceps. He talks about it as what fitness enables for you to be more effective as a human being, to make you feel better, to deal with mental health. Multiplexity, which we'll touch on, and I'm sure next week's seminar will deal with in more detail, is that ability to connect in a number of ways and levels. So those who watch him will know one of his children is called Indy, and he brings his wife and his children, so he makes himself very accessible. And then he catchphrases it around this being the nation's PT. So there's a guy I've certainly never met. I would doubt anyone on this has ever met, but is able to build that trust online quite effectively. So then let's go into how I think we've established hopefully now the importance of trust and relationships, how they aren't measured and probably should be, and why there's an imperative, we believe, on driving positive relations forward to create high-performing teams and high-performing companies. So this is what's going to really be dug into next week, but let me just give an overarching view of it. So thank you to the Relationships Foundation for this. This is the overarching framework based on this 25 years of concrete study as to what 5 key drivers of a relationship are. So encounter being the first. So that is, how do we communicate? So that's the face-to-face email context. So that how we creating a clear sense of connection and avoiding misunderstandings. So how do we encounter each other? what is our narrative? What is our storyline? Our storyline is that which gives us connection. So I use the example how I know Simon initially through Mozambique. Now that was a very storming and forming relationship given the adversity of those circumstances. But that gives a narrative which is we have a high level of trust for a substantive period of time because of that narrative between us. Knowledge, again, how much do we really understand each other and how much are we trying to understand each other? So that enables us to build better relationships by understanding the context we faced. I had an email from someone very close to me at the weekend who had put in writing basically an explanation of what has happened in their lives that have driven some of the thinking they currently have in which we're currently trying to support each other on. And that was very refreshing as someone I knew well to get under the skin of that knowledge of how they were thinking and sharing that. And that sharing is constructive then in a strong relationship. Fairness, I've used it in the context with a number of my legal friends that the legal system is the quantification of fairness. And they kind of fall into either laughter or really liking its categories. Because that is what our fairness system should certainly appear in our legal system. But one of the challenges out of this COVID is there is an expectation that consequent to seeing through the current scenario, we could well move into periods of litigation. So how do we ensure that we keep building positive relationships rather than litigious relationships? Because I think we need to be honest with each other, and some of the challenges I know you all on this call will be facing. There are some hard people and financial decisions you're going to be taking, which might be outside employment contracts, but need to be negotiated together. And that build that relationship, what you have banked in your credibility of trust and relationship will very much define your ability to achieve that. And then finally, then in terms of alignment, this is really important because for me, this is part of that purpose, values, goals. These are the things that give you something tangible to hang your hat on. I remember doing a piece of work with what was actually a gym that a few years back. And I observed through knowing them as directors of the business that they weren't aligned. But in my conversations with them, they all believed themselves to be beautifully aligned. And we had an afternoon session which opened with, what is your purpose for this business? And this, 5 of them all had different purposes. So the reason they were starting to get conflict was because they didn't have that mutuality of shared purpose. And that shared purpose should be fed not just into your employer-employee relationships, but also more across the board into your wider stakeholder relationships. So again, thank you for the relationship proximity framework to the Relationship Foundation. I think it's what we base and we find very useful for our structure for relational thinking.
Andrew, thank you so much for that first part, which has really established the key role and centrality of relationships in our thinking. We've got a poll for you to take part in now, which will appear on your screen. And the question is, do you think the quality of your key relationships in your organizations over the past 2 weeks has got better, got worse, or stayed much the same? So we're going to launch that poll and we'd ask you to take part in it as it appears on your screen. There you go. You should be able to see that poll now in front of you. Okay, so some interesting results. We have about 60 people on the, there you go, 60 people. I'm going to end the poll now. We've had about 35, 36 of you. Anyone else want to have a final go on that poll? Just give you a couple of seconds to do that. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you. So interestingly, the results say that about 50% of you say they've got better. Fascinating, isn't it? Socially distant and working from home, but they've got better. Only 2% say get worse. About 50% of you say they stay in the same. So why don't you reflect on that in the chat? Why do you think they've got better? Why do you think they're staying the same? But also maybe pose some questions for Andrew as he goes into this second session as well. We'll be collating your questions. Matthew's looking at them and looking at our chat, and we'll be collating those and putting them to Andrew and myself and Matthew at the end. So Andrew, over to your next session.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, indeed, interesting results. I think I thought it might have more getting better, but it's interesting how counterintuitive that is. So that's excellent. Be good to chat that through later. Okay, so I think I just need to move that up the screen. There we go. So I think this is really interesting. So this comes from a think tank in America, Praxis, and it starts to think about what we actually see happening. So for those of you who are historical buffs, or for those of you who aren't, in 1816, you may or may not know, it was described as the year without a summer. And basically Mount Tambora, which is in Indonesia, had one of those plumes. If you remember, that was also relatively recently happened with Iceland as well. But the plume in this case actually sent lots of Western Europe and the USA into what became known as a mini ice age. And I think they talk about this: are we going through a blizzard, or are we moving into a mini ice age? Is that blizzard going to cause a mini ice age? So it's quite interesting to think of that then in terms of its recovery. Will it be a V-shaped recovery in which we will be bouncing back resolutely, and the end of this year our stock markets will be burgeoning, we'll all be happy, and we'll be on exactly the same path as we were unhappy? Will it be a U-shape? Are we going to face some reasonably medium-term problems and then bounce back? Or are we actually going to face an L-shape where we've actually moved to a different level? And I think one of the things that's interesting is how we measure that. And we can take some lessons from 2008. One of the things I find interesting to hear people talking about at the moment is that having bailed the banks out, they now need to respond. So I know a number of the large ones have suspended dividends, arguably because they've been put under pressure to. But it's interesting, people haven't forgotten some of those lessons from there. So it's quite important that we think about these times in terms of what's happened in the past. And perhaps one final point on this slide is when we think of some of the data around this, I've read some stuff which basically says the deaths caused by economic disaster or economic problems for people will be substantially greater than those that die from COVID. So we might be all happy in our middle class homes, or not happy, but dealing with it. But there is a human tragedy much greater than just of the health side of things. So what are we learning? These are the things that I think we'll all have been reading, and I'm sure we'll be concurring with. The best example, or a good example, certainly I've heard, is someone said to me, it feels like someone said stop and you've got 3 months to decide what's really important. And I think a lot of people, that original BBC video alluded, or more than alluded, to components of that, because we are all equal. So while society has made us arguably unequal, fundamentally we are all equal. We are connected, so I'm sure you've seen the overhead flights paths of a month ago and now over Heathrow and over the UK. So that degree of technology has enabled a huge amount of connection. Health has become more of the fore, so it's now seen much more as a key metric and a higher priority than the economy. which is an interesting place to be. And what is the role of materialism and money anymore? What is it to do? And I'll touch on that later in terms of the purpose of this. And then work and the fact that this is a cyclical thing. So we will have ups and downs. So what I think we're learning then relationally is to get a grip on how we are all human beings, how we relate to each other, how that connection is enabled, how we look after health, not just blind numbers, and how we work together to do that. So there's a number of things being said about learning some of these things across the media, etc. And then some of the things you were saying, one of the things that I had said, which I think was really good, is we've changed more in 7 days than we have in the last 7 years. And I don't know how much of that was seen as a positive or a negative. But organizations that have historically had a bureaucratic construct, and I don't necessarily even mean that critically, but have had a bureaucratic construct, have suddenly turned on a sixpence and responded to that. And you could well argue that some of the charities and some people on the call are in that first responder, that ability to move quickly. But what people have been saying to the three of us is things like people first. And that might reflect in what we saw in the survey, that actually I'm getting better relationships because I'm trying a bit harder, that the change is actually quite seismic of what we're going through. And we're having to create new opportunities from this crisis. So whilst we are managing this crisis on a day-to-day, it is forcing us to be innovative. And so what does that mean relationally for us moving forward? That means we are going to be looking at things like creativity imports more, at how we manage our relationships more effectively, and how that impacts our business and company performance. And I think the one I draw out of those 6 especially is the word agility. So if you think of it historically, those who are in the profit sector will have heard the word agile and agile manufacturing, those sort of things which have become highly prevalent over the last few years. But if they were prevalent in January, how much more prevalent when companies like GSK 2 weeks ago closed their offices of 5,000 people attending. So that agility and ability to deal with this fast-paced, fast-changing environment. So let's move on then into what does this mean? So these are areas we're going to go in much greater detail in the next sessions. But I want to just both introduce them and give some perhaps nuggets of thoughts. So the aim of this is not to give a cerebral, exhaustive list of things that you should be doing from our point of view. It's much to give examples and things to provoke and hopefully enable you to think about some of the things that we're observing. So there's 5 we're going to go through. So we'll start with communicate. So I need to just caveat what I'm saying here. I like to use provocative words to make a point. So to be clear, purposeless in this context, I don't mean devoid of purpose. So what I mean by that is there's perhaps 2 types potentially of communication you're going through, which correlates back to that relationship framework. Purposeful, this is the task-based things which enable you to have alignment, which creates the common sense of purpose, value, and align you to a common vision. So that's highly delivering on today. So it's a purposeful conversation to achieve an outcome. Now, I use the word purposeless, but these other type are every bit as purposeful. But what they are purposeful at is managing emotions and creating connections, showing genuine care and concern. And it's not just about work. So what we see in that is, how do we create a purposeful, purposeless conversation? So there are people doing it in different ways. Some of those ways are having a 10-minute check-in at the start of every meeting, because suddenly we don't have the logistics of moving from meetings to meetings, because they're all held in our living room or study or whatever we abide. So having check-ins at the start, or other companies and organizations are building in specific times. And you can see that in things like virtual coffee, virtual lunches, and even, you know, things like virtual pub quizzes. So people are creating these new opportunities to communicate and engage with people. In the third webinar, Simon is going to deal with this aspect of rhythm in much more detail. Now, I'm sure Evan's been reading up on routine and this whole concept that our calendars have suddenly been trashed. So in those trashed calendars, how do we create a new routine and redefine our priorities? But it's not just about having our what we do at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock to self-manage us, as Lencioni talked about, and put structure and use our time. But it's what are we using that time for? I revert back to the comment that my friend made about I've got 3 months to think about what's important to me. So we need to be making these really difficult day-to-day, inverted commas, blizzard decisions. But we also need to be thinking about the future and our future purpose as a company and business and organization into how we are adept and agile for that future. So it's not just personal structures, it's also about the pace and the thinking of the type of thing, of how we use our time, not just allocating our time. In webinar 4, Matthew's going to deal with this in a lot more detail. This then moves into the new mode of leadership. And those are perhaps 6 bullets, which we think are going to start to impact on what that will actually look like. So that's treating everyone as an individual. Go back to the comments earlier on equality. This transparent and open communication. So how do you avoid the bureaucracy of you just trickle down certain information to really enable people to be leaders and bring them together? And I'll touch on that in a minute. I like the phrase practice humanity, because whilst we're all human, we still need to work at doing it. So it's understanding empathy and social skills. And one of the things I'm a big fan of is this whole being vulnerable. We shouldn't be ashamed of ourselves or the challenges we may be faced. So let's open those out. That doesn't make us look weak. That makes us look strong as leaders, I would argue. Use the technology, and this is going to come through in webinars 5 and 6. We're doing this on Zoom, which I'm sure many of us, though I haven't checked their share price, wish we had shares in them probably in January. So the use of this video chat, which it's a different way of doing things, but what's to say we can't adapt? And in doing it, we embrace life. The famous story a few years ago of the South Korean professor whose kids were running in the background. That was part of his life. It's nothing to be ashamed of, the fact that he has gorgeous little kids. So let's embrace and be comfortable with that. And that touches a little bit on the vulnerableness I referenced in the last point. So use that technology, and things like when you're using it, be mindful of interruptions, listen with intent and purpose, and use it also to have those casual chats. So what does all this mean moving, not just in terms of the blizzard, in terms of the crisis, into this potential mini ice age? And I think the challenge we have is for me in that statement, the danger we face that in solving today's crises, we seriously damage the relationships and trust on which our future organizations rely. I think it's interesting, and this isn't a political comment with the government support going on, different businesses I've heard and spoken to at length are really reacting in different ways, if I were to be quite candid, and obviously I won't be naming any, but some see it as a life support. Others, unfortunately, I think almost feels like they're seeing it as an opportunity. So to maximize their finance position. And that isn't the purpose. This is the time to be pulling together. And I would suggest some of those who don't take a more purposeful across a lot of stakeholders and view it purely as finance could end up inflicting some serious longer term damage by damaging the core stakeholder relationships which they need to move on. So in terms of the future, how do we reimagine that future? So those are some of the things we can think of in the here and now. But what does that mean in terms of the future? a large pharmaceutical I work with a lot with, who I can't name obviously, but I remember speaking to one of their reasonably senior people on the purpose of their organization. And this company has gone through some quite significant strategic changes in the last couple of years. And that person said to me, the problem I have is, whilst I understand the stock market might like this, I want to work for a company that eradicates HIV. And I thought that was a beautiful, simple way of looking at what is a company's purpose. So the MCI defined that purpose as those 5 points: a meaningful reason to form organizational entity, it needs profit, a context for decision making, and unifying stakeholders around that shared purpose. And I'd pull out perhaps a couple of things on that where, may I be as bold as to mildly disagree with the MCI, is purpose doesn't necessarily needs profits. What it does need is the lubricant of money to enable it to be effective. I do passionately believe that we have become a bit hung up on our definition of capitalism, and we just need to be really careful that purpose isn't your EBITDA, isn't your quarterly reporting. There is a significant number of metrics like relationships and your broader purpose with your stakeholder base. And you start to see that now in clothing companies converting from making fashion materials to making aprons for medics, etc., to distilleries making alcohol-based cleaning substances. So it's important to think of that shared purpose in terms of the metrics and being much broader than money. So what are you thinking about in that driving purpose as you move forward? What does it mean to the financial performance and to your relationships? Luke Johnson, ex-Pizza Express, patisserie Villeray, and Gales now, wrote in the Sunday papers on trust is going to be tested to destruction. Covey talks in his book, The Speed of Trust, about how important it is to be able to pivot quickly. A quick example in an Indian procurement organization, which perhaps shows some of our cultural differences globally, where a tender followed all the right processes, had 3 feedbacks coming back, or replies to the tender, should I say, and they were all related to the guy issuing the tender, which caused shock and horror and consternation in the Western world, because you can't do that. And I had to interview that person. That interview person said, well, I would never do anything bad to my family, would I? So isn't that a good thing? So it's interesting to start, and I'm not casting an opinion whether it is good or bad, but what defines our trust and what defines that ability to work together? So in this process, will our bank of trust be enhanced, or are we going to see it depleted? So we see in this, so to me, this is the exciting things about today, is this opportunity to lead. By opportunity to lead, I don't mean in the context of our current organized bureaucracies, but in things like some of the beautiful music we hear done virtually by choirs using technology together, through people doing their shopping for the old people, through neighbors getting to know each other and having dance-offs on their streets. These are things which I would strongly argue is the role of leadership. So how are we enabling and equipping and energizing in those societal things, but also in our organizations, in our companies, to enable people to fulfill themselves in that? And then a good example of this is that in the US intelligence service post 9/11, they had a look into what defined the most high-performing teams in US intelligence. And that fundamentally distilled down to the highest performing teams in US intelligence post 9/11 were those who helped each other out more. And help seems such a soft word in modern hard business speaking, but it's really prevalent to how you actually make your business work. So if help is that important for each other, how do we actually measure that relationship and trust score? I'm sure we have plenty of financial reports, but how we measure in that in terms of our culture. And then in terms of people, what are we missing by knowing that true person? So as I touched on in those leaders, those people who establish those choirs using their passions and competencies, who show the initiative to that, they have taken the time and the effort to lead in a very specific way. So what are we missing in our organization by not understanding both ourselves and some of the component parts of us that has skills, but also of other people? And structure, which will go, again, Matthew will be talking about more, the importance of nimbleness and agility. So the ability to react and change. So as we hear more in the COVID crisis in terms of the numbers, a greater discussion about rates as much as absolute numbers, so will it be in business. Our ability to change and change how we do things and rate of change. Because I believe we can be reasonably sure of what we are doing yesterday isn't what we're going to need to add purpose and value in the future. So to cap that all, for me, it's very much, some of it's time-based. We're in a blizzard today. So it's a case of solving today's, but in solving today's, thinking for the future of what that might mean relationally and how we ensure our relation measures, criticality, and importance is continually focused on.
Andrew, thank you so much. I'm going to launch another quick poll for you before we go into questions and answers. So the question on this is, in which of these future-focused relational areas do you think your organization is least prepared? Purpose, leadership, people, culture, trust, or structure? So here we go. We're going to launch that poll for you. Okay, and I'll give you a minute to vote on that. In which of these future-focused relational areas do you think your organization is least prepared? Vote away. I think people are thinking more about that. Hopefully you can see that. Can you? Matthew, Andrew, can you see?
I can't see that, sorry, Matthew.
Okay, okay, let me stop the share. Let me launch this again. Let's see if I can relaunch it again. Hang on a second. Can you see that now? Has that popped up? Andrew, Matthew, has that popped up?
I can see it on the screen, but it's not giving me a compelling action to do anything.
All right, okay. I'm really sorry, that doesn't seem to have worked. I thought that poll function was fantastic and wonderful the first time around, but not the second time around. So fire away your questions in the chat, and we're going to go into a question and answer time now. And we're going to pass it over to Matthew, who's going to host us for the next 10 minutes in answering your questions. So Matthew, over to you.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Andrew. So some great questions. Thank you so much, folks, for all your comments. And it was interesting how the response to the polls really got people talking. So the first question I think I'd like to throw back to Andrew and Simon. So Ellie, Andy, and Ruth, and actually a few others talked sort of basically say, is this just a short-term thing? You know, it's the blitz spirit. And we'll all get through it. We'll all wake up and discover this was just a brief thing and go back to normal. Is this just about a shared enemy? And it's almost a natural human response that we're going to get beyond. Is this just a short-term thing, guys?
I'd be really concerned if it was, because I'm hoping to see it actually as a catalyst for change, because I think change was needed before, but we were deciding consciously not to change, to be quite honest. But what I cannot say is that we will definitely change, because there's plenty of examples in history. So I referenced the 08 crisis. It could be argued that the inherent issues in place that caused 08, other than capitalizing the banks, are still in place. So my answer would be, I really hope it's not, because I do think we need to think about the future and think about it relationally. But I have no prophetic view that that is definitely going to be the case.
Okay, Simon?
I think it gives us an amazing example to see a different way of living lived out before our eyes. And I think we will be left with choices to make as to whether that experience of how we lived during this time is something that correlates with our core values and therefore drives change into the future. I'm with Andrew that I don't think this is a blizzard. I think it is a period of time that will go on for some time. In the emergency relief business, which I've been in for a lot of my adult life, we would talk about emergency response as being the first phase, and then recovery, and then reconstruction. And we'd expect that to go over multiple years of time. And actually, I think we're just in the response phase right now. And as we think into even the autumn and next year, how we recover looks different to that response phase, but isn't back to a normal or even a new normal. And even in the reconstruction, we get the opportunity to reframe and reconstruct how we want to live into the future. So I think we will be faced with fundamental choices to make, but that informed by our lived reality of the present.
Okay, great. So let me switch somewhere else. So, so Christian and Ellie and actually a couple of others talked about how the entering each other's homes is almost creating more knowledge and background to our relationships. Would you agree?
Wholly agree. I think it's one of the best parts of it. It's suddenly making humanity more accessible and a humanist more. I used the example of the South Korean professor. You know, that went viral at the time because his kids were cute and it was great it happened. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and accepting that we've all got a number of things, not just work.
I would say, though, that just opening up our homes is only the start. Opening up our lives, I'm hopeful that actually we will do the hard work of becoming more self-aware, have the courage to be more vulnerable, to share appropriately. There is no doubt that actually the mental health challenges that are coming with self-isolation and social distancing are things that we're going to need ways to articulate and to frame, and we're going to need people to walk alongside us with that. And I'm hopeful that it will go beyond just letting ourselves into other people's sometimes beautiful homes and sometimes chaotic homes, and opening up our lives as well.
Okay, great. So there's one of the, I think Ellie mentioned this in the chat, that there's she said for us, like doing hand washing, we've revealed that we didn't do enough people connection before. So we probably didn't wash our hands enough as before. And actually, is there a case that actually this is almost highlighting that we just simply have not been communicating enough with colleagues? So we've almost been taking it for granted, or maybe more, it's treating them almost as transactions. And actually this is opening our eyes to the reality of what real relationship and communication needs to look like.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And it's been interesting to see how different businesses and organizations have responded. So I've had people saying to me, oh, I'm finding it more difficult to engage my team right now. We've put our senior management teams online. We've put our one-to-ones online. We've put our board meetings online. And then you start saying, yeah, but actually, are you connecting informally at all? What would it look like for you to have a soup lunch on Friday? What would it look like for you to have a workout Wednesday in the morning? What would it look like for you to create those opportunities for the non-transactional or purposeless, as Andrew described them, conversations? And this is almost forcing that, and I think that's really, really helpful.
I'd briefly say a couple of things. One is through washing my hands, I've actually managed to develop eczema on my hands, which gives an insight into how little I must have been washing my hands before. But I think what it does in terms of this is what we used to do and communicate before is bump into people at a water cooler, at a coffee place, and how many times do we hear the phrase of, have you seen so-and-so, so-and-so? Oh, I must see them soon. And suddenly what we've now moved into is, I can't not see them, I need to communicate. So it's created an imperative which creates an action rather than a casualness in how we view our relationships.
Okay, so maybe time for one or two more questions. So another interesting point a few of you have raised is around the vulnerability of leaders at this time. Andrew, you reminded us in Lencioni's framework the importance of vulnerability at the base of the pyramid.
Yeah.
Again, I don't want to make this a leading question, but have you seen more vulnerability in leaders, in those that you connect with in your networks? And to what extent is this a really important thing for leaders to sort of embrace and move beyond at this time, almost an opportunity?
Can I go first on that? Is that all right? So, interestingly, on the first Wednesday of lockdown, I emailed out to about 25 chief execs of Christian charities who I mainly work with, asking if any of them, if they wanted to join a peer-to-peer facilitated learning network during this time. And I was kind of expecting 3 or 4 of them to reply, but I had 18 of them out of that 25 say immediately, yes, I want to join, and subsequently another 4 who wanted to join those networks. And I think that shows that actually leaders are feeling vulnerable. They're feeling that they need peer-to-peer support, that this is a rapid time of change, and that they need safe and supportive spaces where they can actually be appropriately vulnerable. Most of them have been working 14-hour days for the last couple of weeks, driving significant change. And now this week, the conversation has changed to actually, oh my goodness, we're in this for the long term. How do we come out stronger in the beginning of January 2021 than we are now? I need to set my rhythm. I need to learn to be more vulnerable and more open so that we can get through this.
I largely work with FTSE companies, and I have to be candid, I'm not sure that vulnerableness is necessarily manifest into action yet. And I think part of that, in fairness, is there's quite a big delta between how businesses are managed in that sector. So it's so financially oriented, etc. I think it's actually quite a big change to switch to vulnerable. I am hopeful, maybe some seeds are there, but I do think it's a seismic change to move there.
Okay, great. We're almost on the hour, so Simon, I'm going to hand back to you. There are a whole load more questions people have been asking. So what we're going to try and do is make sure we take those into the future sessions and tackle them there. Thank you so much for being so communicative on the chat. Back to you, Simon.
And finally, thank you so much for attending today. Next week, we're delighted to have Dr. Rob Lowe, Ben Gibbs and John Ashcroft from the Relationships Foundation in Cambridge coming and talking about their 25 years of research and how that's going to enable us to get relationships to thrive in a time of social distancing. So do come and join us next week, 3 o'clock. As a response to this webinar, you will get an email from us with a recording of the webinar that you can link to and share, but also the details of how you register for next week's webinar, which will be at Thursday at 3 o'clock as well. And then you can see the future ones are there. Thanks so much for joining. We've really appreciated you joining in and participating. Thanks for all comments and questions, and have a great week. All right, take care. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.